The changes wrought from the outside of our lives may cause only desperate reactions or may stimulate unreasonable attitudes. By growth, we mean essentially such changes as occur within the person, as the natural consequence of a planned program of self-improvement, or such changes as come as the consequence of an unfolding inner conviction, which formally or non-formally becomes the basis of an inevitable unfoldment of character. Thus, we consider growth to be improvement of character rather than merely change. This is one of the problems that we face socially and in world affairs today. There are a great many persons who consider change for its own sake to be desirable. Sometimes this can be defended, but more usually we substitute the concept of change for the concept of progress, and the terms are not synonymous. Thus we assume, for example, that if things are different, they are better. In any event, in an effort to accommodate to what we call change, we may make rather foolish adjustments. Adjustments not to facts, but to passing fancies or fads, which will themselves pass out of fashion in a comparatively short time. Therefore, growth is not a matter of fashion. It is not a matter of adjustment to things in themselves inconsequential, non-important, or non-factual. Gradually, therefore, we recognize two sources of modification of conduct within our own natures, these being the pressures of change, fashion, and circumstances, and the real or essential driving influence of individual improvement. And growth, being a matter of improvement, gives us a clue immediately to the prevailing problem which arises from change. Individuals moved by change become confused. They become uncertain of conduct. They may contradict themselves, or they may get themselves into complicated situations. This type naturally will cause a desperate effort for remedy, and the individual, floundering about in his own changes, looks for some kind of security and anchorage. He may find such security only by further compromise of his own character or nature, or by the simple development of patience to endure the results of his own mistakes. More essentially, however, growth, being an improvement, can never cause a situation which is essentially less than that which preceded it. In other words, an individual, by the process of growth, does not become unreasonable. By the process of growth, he does not become more cruel than he was before, nor does he become more scattered or uncertain than he was before, nor does he lose any of the values which he previously possessed, if these values are real. Growth, because it leads to solution, or in the direction of a general betterment, always carries within itself a certain constructive and remedying power. The individual can outgrow a lesser thing, but this does not cause him to lose sight of previous values, or to develop bitterness or chagrin or antagonism. The idea that growth must be a brutal fulfillment of our own purpose is simply untrue. And a growth for the individual which can be achieved only by injury to others is contrary to the principle of growth, because growth is to make all things less injurious, it being assumed that ignorance is the real source of all injury. We say that ignorance is the source of injury because ignorance is the source of a series of particular attitudes which are themselves unsound and which can cause difficulty. Thus, for example, ignorance will cause or abet selfishness. The individual is selfish only because he is ignorant. Selfishness being a negative, being a thing of its own nature undesirable, cannot be the result of growth. It must be the result of the failure of the individual to grow in some particular situation. As growth is a gradual overcoming of ignorance, perhaps comparatively slow, perhaps overcoming only one detail at a time, but still overcoming that which is less is the only way in which we can achieve to that which is more. Thus we are always suspended between more and less, and those who wish to grow strive to become associated more intimately with that which is more, that which is nearer to the reality or closer to the truth. If we therefore begin to study the consequences of increased knowledge, we then ask ourselves rather simply, does knowledge lead to growth? Knowledge can lead to growth. Knowledge can lead to learning. But we can also take postgraduate courses in various types of information, which only enables us to become schemas, only permits us to take further advantage. We may study law to discover the loopholes in it. We may variously inform ourselves, but information is not necessarily growth. Information or knowledge can contribute to growth. Only, however, if this knowledge is properly and honorably used. Therefore, knowledge must be accepted into the consciousness of the individual, must be used as the basis of the strengthening of his own character. And unless he becomes personally something better, the accumulation of knowledge will not of itself guarantee any general improvement of his nature. There have been a number of very brilliant persons possessing a great deal of knowledge who have not found either happiness, security, or honor from this knowledge itself, but have used it for their own detriment and for the detriment of other people. Thus, we cannot say that an individual is better because he knows more, nor can we say that he is better because he has more. We cannot assume that growth must inevitably result from the improvement of social condition, particularly in the direction of excessive luxury. We can say, however, that economic security can contribute to growth by freeing the mind of certain worries, fears, doubts, or supplying the life in a total picture with those necessities and reasonable luxuries by which the person is able to devote more and more of his time, attention, and energy to the cultivation of the better part of himself. Always, growth results from right use and not from possession per se. Now it happens, and it will always happen, that an individual attempting to live better than his time will come upon certain obstacles. Certain situations will arise which will appear to be temptations and which will cause him a certain amount of concern, especially if his total nature is not in accord with the situation in which he finds himself. We do know, however, that growth provides also increasing instruments of control and use. As the individual truly grows, he becomes more intelligently capable of directing his own destiny. Again, this additional directive power may not be excessive, but we have learned from experience that true growth permits the individual who is growing to meet the inevitable consequences of the actual process of growth with increasing faculties and powers, so that actually his condition is improved rather than injured. And his new level of attainment is no more difficult for him to maintain than his previous level, because he now has additional means of maintenance. If he finds himself in a superior condition, or at a condition above that which he previously occupied, but does not have the means of maintenance within himself, then something is wrong. And what he calls growth cannot be considered to be growth. It can only be a change accompanied by certain visible phenomena which we generally associate with improvement. Thus, for example, if a man is promoted from one position to another, he is congratulated. It is assumed that his abilities justify this promotion, and that he has been raised to an honorable position because he is capable of filling that position. If all these facts are as they should be, this man will not be in trouble as a result of his promotion. But if he is not able to administer his new position with intelligence, he will be under unusual stress and strain, may be subject to later demotion, or may, in an effort to exceed his own natural capacities, place himself in a situation which will endanger his health and even his life. This is not because he has been advanced. It is because he was unable to meet the challenge of this advancement. Thus, we cannot assume that any appearance of improvement must necessarily mean that this improvement is real and next in the life of that person. This is only one aspect of our problem, but it perhaps brings rather clearly into focus the essential situation itself. Change moves a person from one place to another. Growth moves an individual upward from one state of himself to a superior state. This growth may or may not be reflected in his physical conditions. There are many cases in which a person, increasing in wisdom, has chosen to give away his worldly goods and remain poor. He has decided that in the search of wisdom, his true wealth depended upon the sacrifice of that which was no longer real or necessary to him. On the other hand, this individual is not unmindful that if he places himself in a completely impecunious situation, that he will then become a dependent, and the wise person will not voluntarily place himself in this condition. If he makes a decision of this kind, he will also bear in mind his responsibility to others who may or may not share in his own personal feelings as to what constitutes a suitable life for himself. If, therefore, he has responsibilities, growth will not cause him to neglect them, but rather for him to have a more and deeper feelingfulness toward these responsibilities and the ability to carry them with additional and increased grace of conscience. Unless these dignities are present, the individual has not increased substantially or essentially, although he may appear to have improved his mind. In the ordinary life of the individual, however, these major decisions do not so often appear. The processes of growth are very gradual, and the individual who is really growing is seldom placed in an emergency. Nature, in preparing the development of things, does not create emergency growths in most instances. In fact, very seldom do we find anything which is even to be interpreted in this way. Actually, nature does not take the 2-year-old child and 3 weeks later make an adult out of that child. Such would create an impossible crisis in the development of the child's mind, emotions, and body. And in spite of all of our various modifications in life today, the processes of physical growth still continue quietly, sequentially, inevitably, but so gradually that it is only after a period of time that any noticeable change can be observed. It is the same way in our spiritual and ethical development. We are not foolish one night and all wise the next day. We are not suddenly confronted with the pace of essential growth. We are confronted only with processes, slowly, quietly operating. And these processes produce their own natural consequences, for which we should be just as prepared as we are for the natural consequences of physical growth. As the child grows up along the way, the child gradually becomes aware of the changes that are taking place, and through the support of society and family is assisted in making these adjustments, so that maturity is not a problem, but a bestowal of opportunity. Maturity is something to be desired, except in the individual who does not mature. The person who is afraid of maturity is the perpetual adolescent. And this is a person whose maturity is of the body only, and whose mind and emotions have not adequately grown up. Man, however, because he possesses a mental equipment of his own, is capable of causing a certain procrastination in the process of his own growth. He can choose to waste time. He can choose to be indifferent to the essential needs of his life and the needs of his responsibilities. He can choose to dawdle along the way, like the schoolboy approaching the schoolhouse as slowly as possible. He is capable also of so involving himself in psychological situations that his natural growth is temporarily impeded. If, however, he does grow and fulfills nature's purposes, growing naturally, developing faculties, maturing through experience and experimentation, the various elements of his own nature, he will find that he arrives at a maturity which is a reward and not a punishment, and that the new responsibilities which he carries are appropriate to the new powers which he has to carry them, so that he will have no more difficulty at 40 being 40 than he had at 10 being 10. In fact, he has a great deal more opportunity, because he is better equipped at 40 to be 40, really, than he was at 10 to be 10. He now has perspective, values. He's able to take on experiences and observe. He's able to make more mature decisions and judgments as his life unfolds. We frequently find, however, that individuals who really believe that they are trying very hard to grow are constantly getting themselves into trouble. Perhaps this is because they are trying to grow rather than allowing themselves to grow. Now, there's a great deal of difference. When we try to grow, it is usually because we have a fixed goal in mind. We are trying to be something that we have decided to be before we know what we ought to be. And there's a great deal of trouble arising from this. We cannot, in this life, with the knowledge which we possess, decide completely and inevitably what kind of a maturity we are going to enjoy. We must decide always, of course, any future state by a present group of faculties. Therefore, when we become too fixed in estimating what we desire to be, we limit the future with our present faculties, not aware of the fact that if we permitted ourselves to grow, then the future would be measured by the faculties of the future when the time comes. This does not mean that we have no right to select a career or to determine that which is most reasonable in the light of what our present knowledge conveys to us. But just as it is dangerous to be dogmatic in religion, so it is likewise dangerous to be dogmatic in the determination of our own character. We must always allow for growth. We must always allow that the future may cause us to see new things in a better way, or even old things with more intelligence. Thus, where we get into our greatest trouble is when, in the effort to grow, we set goals, and having perhaps even achieved these goals, we then assume that this achievement constitutes the consummation of growth. The individual, for example, says that at a certain period in life, he would like to be a physician. He becomes a successful doctor. He has now fulfilled his life purpose, and he has two choices: either to sit back and enjoy fulfillment, which is the beginning of death, or to continue to grow, to find new goals, and consider any achievement that he has made as merely a step towards a greater achievement yet to come. It is therefore very dangerous to place any fixed goals upon ourselves other than the grand goal that as we can and in every way that we can, we shall get better. We shall be more intelligent, more understanding, more correct in all of our procedures. If, however, we decide a certain thing which we wish to do or to be, and do not take into consideration our natural aptitudes and abilities, we may find that this decision, if we insist upon fulfilling it, will present our lives with innumerable tragedies. I know a case, for example, of a man who started out in life when he was in his early 20s. He made a simple statement to himself, namely that he never intended to become involved in anything. He did not intend to allow anyone to get near enough to him, to be his good friend, or to become his enemy. He never intended to marry, because this was a responsibility. He never intended to raise children. He never intended to do anything except maintain his own interests. Now, obviously, this was a rather isolationist position, and he tried desperately to maintain it. And he finally achieved a fair degree of maintenance for this particular idea, and lived a hopelessly impoverished and miserable life, was unhappy himself, his only hollow consolation being that he had done what he pleased. He discovered in the end, however, that it never pleased him. These types of decisions can apply to situations perhaps less obvious and equally insidious. We can settle down, for example, in a family with the final resolution that we are going to convert the members of that family to our opinion on something. Now, this is a common practice. This is what is commonly known as prevailing procedure and is justified on the grounds that everybody does it. It is also demonstrated on the grounds that everybody who does it is in trouble, but no one pays much attention to this, as each individual regards himself as an exception to all universal laws. If, however, a person setting such a goal is unable to attain it, which is quite possible, this person is miserable. And because his goal demands that other people change, it is very easy for him to take the attitude that they are very unpleasant people if they refuse to change. They may take the attitude that he is a very unpleasant person because he demands that they change. This can lock itself into a very desperate policy, continuing over a period of years, ending in martyrdom, misery, and perhaps actual crime, if people are pressed beyond a reasonable degree and beyond the power of their own self-control. The individual trying to force his opinion upon others does so because he believes that he knows more than they do, that he is better equipped than they are, and perhaps that he has received some special dispensation that has been denied to other mortals. All this, to his mind, adds up to the fact that he has grown, when actually it only adds up to the fact that he has developed an intensive fixation, which can cause him a lot of trouble. But when we leave a religion, or we leave a church, or we leave a creed, we leave it because we are hoping to find something bigger. And if we are really in need of something bigger, this new bigness does not cause us to quarrel with the past or to quarrel with what we have left behind. It causes us to be grateful for what we have had, in order that we might grow through it to the thing that we next desire. So where we leave anything with bitterness, if that thing itself is basically honorable, we leave it with bitterness because we have not outgrown it, but because it conflicts in some way with our own ego. If we have really become bigger, we will include what we previously knew in anything that comes after. Just as in childhood, our own childhood does not cease. It does not perish. The 10-year-old child does not die when the 12-year-old child is born. All that was the 10-year-old child continues with something more added. And without the 10-year-old child, the 12-year-old child could not be. And without the devout faith in some previous belief, we could not have grown to the point where we might desire a larger and more comprehensive belief. Therefore, growth does not put us to war. Growth does not cause us to ridicule or condemn. Growth causes us to recognize that at various stages in human development, man must necessarily believe according to his capacity to believe. And that as he outgrows his limitation, his beliefs change. But these beliefs never become evil. They never become bad. And the growth from one thing to another does not lead to hate or to condemnation or to criticism of past things, but rather all growth leads to charity, to love, to understanding, to the realization of our indebtedness to that which we have outgrown. Therefore, we move forward without conflict, without bitterness from one experience to another. The same is true in every department of life. The job which we would like to leave behind, the situation which seems to press in on us too hard. As we move from these things by outgrowing them, we come to the final realization that we cannot walk out of anything, but we can grow out of everything. And then growing out, we grow above and beyond. And that therefore we are always as beings better than we were before. And betterness in this case means more kindly, more rich in understanding, more patient, more correct in judgment, more tolerant, more generous in judgment, and with greater capacity for affection and friendship. Thus, if our growth does not result in a marked improvement in our own character, then we should examine this concept of growth more carefully to determine whether or not we have mistaken change for growth, or have permitted ourselves to assume that an increasing intellectualism is synonymous with increasing understanding, which may or may not be the case.